American grocery bills are about to explode, and the cause isn't what you think. There's a silent crisis unfolding in agricultural trade that threatens the foundation of U.S. food production. The United States imports 87% of a fertilizer component that cannot be replaced, cannot be substituted, and without which modern farming completely collapses. That component is potash, and it comes almost exclusively from Canada. Right now, escalating tariffs and trade threats are transforming this geological dependency into an economic catastrophe. Farmers are already bleeding cash. Spring planting season is weeks away. And the worst part? Most Americans have absolutely no idea this crisis exists until they see the price tags at checkout. This is the fertilizer war nobody's talking about, and it's about to hit every household in America. The numbers behind America's potash dependency are staggering and reveal a supply chain vulnerability that cannot be fixed with political rhetoric. According to Natural Resources Canada, the country sits on approximately 1.1 billion tons of potash reserves, roughly 5 times larger than U.S. domestic reserves. In 2023, Canada accounted for 32% of global potash production and controlled 41% of worldwide exports. The scale difference is even more dramatic. Canadian potash mining operations produce at a level 36 times larger than anything the United States currently achieves. Saskatchewan alone operates 11 active mines, producing an estimated 21.9 million tons annually. Nutrien, the world's largest potash producer, headquartered in Saskatchewan, shipped over 14.4 million metric tons in 2024 to more than 40 countries. The United States, by contrast, operates small-scale potash facilities in Utah, New Mexico, and Michigan. But industry experts consistently note these mines struggle with lower quality potash rock and limited capacity. The U.S. Geological Survey confirms that America imports 90% of the potash its farmers require, and 85% of those imports come directly from Canada. There are no alternative suppliers that can fill this gap at scale. Russia and Belarus possess potash production capacity, but international sanctions imposed after Russia's invasion of Ukraine have made them completely unreliable sources. Morocco produces potash, but shipping from North Africa to the American Midwest is logistically complex and prohibitively expensive. Canada has the United States in a geological chokehold, and both countries know it. Hey guys, use this voice to express excitement, describe a promo, engage with customers, or bring life to your social media, or any project you imagine. The economic analysis paints a devastating picture of cascading costs and structural vulnerability. In early January 2025, potash prices sat around $303 per short ton. By late February, after the 25% tariff announcement, prices surged to $348 per ton, a $45 jump in less than 2 months, driven purely by tariff uncertainty, according to Reuters. Current reports from Illinois production cost analyses show potash prices hovering around $450 per ton in early 2026, representing a nearly 50% increase in just over a year. Some analysts estimate that if the full 25% tariff passes through to end buyers, costs could rise by more than $100 per ton for Canadian-sourced supplies. The U.S. Import Price Index for chemical fertilizers climbed from 164.5 in December 2024 to 186.5 by September 2025. The USDA's Prices Paid Index, which tracks farmer input costs, rose to 149.9 in June 2025, up from 139.9 the previous year, with fertilizer as the primary driver of that increase. For context, fertilizer represents between 30% and 45% of annual operating costs for American farmers. For corn farmers specifically, that figure reaches 45% of all operating expenses. These aren't optional purchases. Applying the correct amount of fertilizer at the right time is the difference between profit and loss. Farmers have zero pricing power. They sell crops at market-determined prices while absorbing input cost increases with no ability to pass them along. Bob Thompson, president of the Michigan Farmers Union, explained the brutal math. Any added costs brought by tariffs get passed down to individual farmers, and they have no way of recouping that expense. Bill Knudsen, a professor at Michigan State's Department of Agricultural, Food, and Resource Economics, laid out the cascade effect. Tariffs push potash prices up and farm profits down. Just about any crop uses potash in some capacity, so reduced profitability hits across the board. U.S. agriculture is staring down a historic collapse in farm income. Projections for the 2025 to 26 crop season estimate losses of roughly $44 billion across major crops, $20 billion for corn, $10 billion for soybeans, and $8.5 billion for wheat. Production expenses in 2025 hit record levels of $467 billion, nearly $12 billion higher than 2024 and $85 billion above the 10-year average. The gap between what farmers spend and what they earn has reached a 10-year high. Farmers are drawing down equity, tapping reserves, and taking on expensive debt just to survive. Some will receive financial assistance through federal farm aid programs, but that support isn't scheduled to arrive until October 2026, far too late for spring planting, which is when farmers need cash to purchase fertilizer, seed, and equipment. By the time federal checks arrive, many operations will have already collapsed. The ones that survive will pass increased costs directly to food processors, distributors, and retailers, who will ultimately pass them to consumers. Every crop grown in America, corn, soybeans, wheat, potatoes, vegetables, fruits, depends on potassium from potash. When potash prices jump $150 per ton, that cost ripples through the entire food system. Public opinion on this crisis reveals a dangerous information gap. Most Americans have no awareness that the United States depends almost entirely on Canadian fertilizer imports, or that tariffs are driving costs skyward. National polling shows trade policy ranks low among voter concerns compared to inflation, immigration, and healthcare. But ironically, trade policy is directly fueling food inflation that voters do care about intensely. Farmers themselves are acutely aware and increasingly vocal. The American Farm Bureau Federation, National Corn Growers Association, and National Farmers Union have all issued statements opposing fertilizer tariffs, warning of severe economic harm and long-term damage to U.S. agriculture. Local media in agricultural states has covered the story extensively, but national outlets have largely ignored it, meaning urban and suburban voters remain unaware of the looming food price shock. Social media conversation among farmers on platforms like Ag Twitter shows rising frustration and desperation, with many expressing betrayal that an administration claiming to support rural America is implementing policies that directly threaten their livelihoods. Media framing has been limited where it exists. Conservative outlets like Fox Business have covered it primarily from a reshoring manufacturing angle, emphasizing the administration's long-term vision. Progressive outlets like Vox and The Atlantic have framed it as another example of trade war blowback harming American workers. Mainstream outlets like the New York Times and the Washington Post have run occasional pieces but haven't sustained coverage. The story lacks the dramatic visuals or clear villains that drive sustained media attention, even though its economic impact will eventually touch every American household. This awareness gap means political pressure on the administration remains muted outside agricultural states, giving Trump room to maintain his position despite the economic damage. From an international and comparative perspective, Canada is playing a sophisticated long game, while the United States traps itself in self-defeating policy. Canadian potash producers are responding to U.S. tariff threats, not by lobbying against them, but by diversifying their customer base and reducing dependency on the American market. Nutrien's late 2025 announcement that it would build a new potash export terminal at the Port of Longview in Washington state, not in British Columbia, stunned Canadian officials but revealed the company's strategy. The terminal, requiring an investment between $500 million and $1 billion, will serve markets in India, China, and other international regions. This signals that Canada's potash giants view the U.S. market as increasingly unpredictable and are positioning for global expansion. BHP's massive Jansen project in Saskatchewan is on track to begin production in mid-2027, with Stage 1 producing approximately 4.15 million tons annually. Stage 2, already 14% complete, will add another 4.36 million tons by June 2031, bringing total capacity to 8.5 million tons per year. Future stages could expand production to between 16 million and 17 million tons annually. Nearly all of that production targets international markets, not the United States. Canada's trade deal with China, signed in January 2026, further demonstrates this pivot, while Trump views it as a threat, posting on Truth Social that Canada would face a 100% tariff if the deal proceeds. Canada views it as a strategic necessity given U.S. trade instability. China and India represent massive, growing fertilizer markets with none of the political volatility currently defining U.S.-Canada relations. From Canada's perspective, why tie your economic future to an unreliable partner when you have the world's largest agricultural markets competing for your product? Other countries are watching this dynamic closely. Brazil, Australia, and several European nations have expressed interest in securing long-term potash supply agreements with Canadian producers, further reducing the leverage the United States once had. The international comparison is stark. Every other major agricultural economy treats fertilizer supply chains as critical infrastructure and pursues stable, predictable trade relationships with suppliers. The United States is alone in weaponizing tariffs against its most reliable fertilizer source. Geopolitically, this strengthens Canada's hand immensely while weakening U.S. food security. Understanding who wins and who loses from this crisis requires mapping the interests, resources, and strategies of every major stakeholder. American farmers are the most direct victims. They face skyrocketing input costs with no ability to pass them along, trapped between geological reality and political policy. Corn, soybean, and wheat growers, the backbone of U.S. agriculture, are bleeding equity and taking on unsustainable debt. Their only leverage is political pressure on lawmakers, but that pressure has proven insufficient to change Trump's course. Their next move will likely be increased lobbying spending and possibly lawsuits claiming the tariffs violate the USMCA, though such legal challenges face long odds. Canadian potash producers are the clear winners. Nutrien, BHP, and other Saskatchewan-based companies benefit from higher prices in the U.S. market while simultaneously expanding into more reliable international markets. Their strategy is patient and long-term. Absorb short-term volatility, invest billions in global infrastructure, and reduce exposure to American political risk. They're not fighting Trump's tariffs, they're simply building around them. The Trump administration claims it's pursuing American energy independence and industrial reshoring, but the policy is achieving the opposite. Agriculture Secretary Brooke Rollins and USDA officials point to a proposed potash mine in Osceola County, Michigan, that could eventually produce 800,000 tons annually. But the project depends on a $1.1 billion federal loan that received only conditional approval in January 2025. Even if the loan finalizes and construction begins immediately, the mine won't reach full production for years, and 800,000 tons represents just 7% of the 11.7 million metric tons the U.S. imported from Canada in 2024. The administration's core motivation appears political rather than economic. Demonstrating toughness on trade plays well with the base, even if it economically devastates key constituencies. American consumers represent the ultimate losers in this scenario, though most don't realize it yet. Every cost increase absorbed by farmers must eventually be passed downstream or result in farm failures that reduce food supply. Either scenario leads to higher grocery prices. Consumer advocacy groups have been largely silent on this issue, because the mechanism connecting tariffs to food prices isn't obvious to non-experts. But by late 2026 and into 2027, the connection will become painfully clear. Democratic opposition politicians have a strong interest in amplifying this crisis as the 2028 election approaches, framing it as yet another example of Trump's trade policies backfiring on American families. Canadian government officials find themselves in an unusually strong position. They don't need to retaliate directly. They can simply allow market forces and geography to do the work while pursuing trade diversification with more stable partners like China, India, and the EU. Looking ahead, the future trajectory of this crisis depends on a handful of critical variables, and none of the likely scenarios offer American farmers much hope. The most probable scenario, roughly 60% likelihood, is continued escalation followed by partial retreat. Trump maintains aggressive tariff threats through spring 2026 to demonstrate resolve and satisfy his political base, causing fertilizer prices to spike even higher as farmers purchase supplies for planting. After sustained pressure from GOP lawmakers in agricultural states and mounting evidence of farm bankruptcies, the administration grants temporary exemptions or tariff reductions for the 2026 growing season, kicking the problem down the road. This scenario leaves farmers in constant uncertainty, unable to plan or invest long-term, while Canadian producers continue their global diversification. Prices remain elevated above historical norms but don't reach catastrophic levels. The best-case scenario, perhaps 20% likelihood, involves the administration reversing course entirely, acknowledging that geological reality cannot be changed through tariffs and that punishing farmers doesn't serve American interests. This would require Trump to frame the reversal as a strategic victory rather than a retreat, possibly by extracting symbolic concessions from Canada on unrelated trade issues. If this happens before spring planting, farmers could avoid the worst impacts, though trust in U.S. trade policy would remain permanently damaged, and Canadian producers would continue diversifying anyway. The worst-case scenario, 20% likelihood, is Trump follows through on the threatened 100% tariff on all Canadian goods in response to the China trade deal. This would make Canadian potash economically inaccessible for most American farmers, forcing them to either skip fertilizer applications, resulting in drastically reduced yields, or source from distant, expensive alternatives like Morocco or politically risky suppliers like Russia. Food production would decline significantly, triggering supply shortages and price spikes that ripple through the entire economy. Farm bankruptcies would surge, rural communities would collapse, and the 2028 election would be decided partly on food security failures. There's also a wild card scenario, technological breakthrough or rapid scaling of domestic alternatives. Some researchers point to experimental fertilizer production methods or alternative potassium sources, but even the most optimistic timelines put commercial viability years away, far too late to address the current crisis. The key variables that will determine which scenario unfolds include Trump's political calculations about the 2028 election, the strength of GOP pushback from farm state lawmakers, the speed at which Canadian producers sign long-term contracts with China and India, and whether farm bankruptcies reach levels that trigger broader economic concerns. The spring 2026 planting season represents a critical decision point. If farmers face another year of crippling input costs while watching crop prices remain depressed, the political pressure on Trump could become unsustainable. But if he remains committed to trade brinkmanship regardless of the cost, the damage will compound. What remains most uncertain is consumer reaction. If grocery price increases become severe enough and clearly traceable to fertilizer costs, public pressure could force policy changes. But if the increases are moderate and diffuse across many products, voters may not connect them to Trump's tariff policies, allowing the administration to avoid political consequences. The outcome likely depends on factors that are inherently unpredictable: Trump's mood, advice from his inner circle, and whether he views backing down on this issue as a sign of weakness or smart flexibility. This crisis exposes a fundamental vulnerability in American agriculture that decades of market-driven policy never addressed. The United States built a food production system that depends almost entirely on a single foreign supplier for a critical, irreplaceable input. That system worked brilliantly when trade relationships were stable and predictable, but it collapses under the weight of economic nationalism and trade wars. The lesson here isn't that tariffs are always bad or that global supply chains are always good. It's that weaponizing trade policy without understanding the underlying geological and economic constraints leads to catastrophic unintended consequences. American farmers didn't create this vulnerability. They responded rationally to market incentives and geological reality. Potash exists where it exists, and Canada has it in abundance. But now they're paying the price for policy decisions made in Washington by officials who seem not to understand or not to care that you cannot reshape geology with tariffs. For consumers, the reckoning is coming. Food prices are about to climb in ways that most Americans won't immediately understand. The bag of fertilizer a farmer couldn't afford in spring becomes the expensive loaf of bread on your shelf in fall. The political system that promised to put America first is instead guaranteeing America pays more. Spring planting starts in weeks. Fertilizer prices are at record highs. Farmers are out of options. And the crisis most Americans don't know about is about to become impossible to ignore. If this story matters to you, if you eat food, if you care about rural America, if you want to understand how trade policy directly impacts your daily life, subscribe to this channel for continued coverage as this crisis unfolds. Drop a comment. Are you seeing food price increases where you live? Do you think the administration will back down or double down? And share this video. This story isn't getting enough attention, and by the time most people notice, it'll be too late to prevent the damage. The fertilizer war is here, and we're all about to pay for it.